Hello, everybody, and welcome to Introduction to Psychology. This lesson is on the types of learning that we normally talk about in an Introduction to Psychology class. Um, First of all, I want to explain what we mean by learning. If you look at the definition, it's a systematic, relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs through experience. This is a little bit different than what we traditionally think about when we think about the process of learning. Usually, when we think about learning, we think about what we do in the classroom. This is not necessarily what we mean as psychologists when we talk about behavior, learning and whatnot. Usually, what we talk about when we're talking about classroom is more of what we'll talk about in the memory sections coming up. First, I'd like to talk about how learning has been studied traditionally in psychology and how it has evolved over the years. And I want to talk about a group of psychologists who called themselves behaviorists, coming from B.F. Skinner and John B. Watson, who you probably read a bit about in chapter 1 of the textbook. Behaviorism arose as psychology was developing as a science. And a group of psychologists, mainly John B. Watson, and then later one of the strongest advocates was B.F. Skinner, came along and they said, this stuff from Sigmund Freud is more philosophical, and the stuff being produced in the labs and stuff is more introspective. It's not truly science. And what these psychologists really wanted to do is make psychology a hard science, meaning that they wanted psychology to be seen more as the field of chemistry and physics and biology and those types of fields, to where it's seen as a hard science rather than this introspective armchair philosophy that they viewed it as a day. So what they proposed is that psychology should only study those things which the physical sciences study, and those are things that we can observe. And the basis of their argument is, what are things that can be observed? Well, we can observe stimuluses in the environment, and we can observe the response or the behavior of the organism in response to those stimuluses. And what they argued is that a scientific study of psychology should be the study of behavior, those things that can be physically observed, and stimuluses. And that anything in between, all mental processes, those would include things like memory, intelligence, emotions, feelings, all of those things should be excluded in the scientific study of psychology. And so for approximately 70, 80 years, here in the United States specifically, psychology was dominated by this field called behaviorism, where literally what we studied was just stimuluses in the environment and the responses of the organism. Now, this had a tremendous effect on society, and I'll give two quick examples. First one is in child rearing. So a little story about John B. Watson. You'll see in this section there's a video of the little Albert experiments, where they were showing how fear can be conditioned. And one of John B. Watson's famous lines is, "Give me your children and I'll make them into what you want," whether it be a lawyer or a judge or a doctor, using the principles of operant and classical conditioning. And he strongly believed that what shapes children is these principles of learning that we're going to learn in this section. And so what happens is with the little Albert experiment, as you'll see, he wanted to prove that fear is a conditioned response. So as you'll see in this video, they have little Albert, which is a little infant, and they present a little white mouse with Albert that he had never interacted with. Little Albert thought, no big deal. But then they made a big clang noise behind Albert, and what they found is eventually little Albert became fearful of the little white rat, hence indicating that fear is a conditioned response. Now, what does this have to do with how it has impacted society? Well, one, it has impacted treatment for phobias and fears, is that we use what's called counter conditioning and behavioral techniques to condition out fear responses. So that's one way that he's influenced that. But there was another way. The individual he did the little Albert experiments was his graduate assistant, Miss Rainier. And as all things that happen when you're in close quarters with someone for a very long time, is Watson and Rainier end up having an affair. And John B. Watson is married at the time. And the university gives him an option. He can either cut off his affair with his graduate assistant or resign. And as all, I guess, love story goes, he resigns and divorces his wife and marries Rainier. And then he goes into marketing and he writes a book on child rearing. Now let me give you, first I'll talk about child rearing, and then I'll talk about the marketing aspect. Before John B. Watson's book, it was believed in general that children were born with all their natural skills intact, meaning your child's going to be who they are regardless of any attempts you make, and your job is the disciplinary or whatever to make sure that they stay in line with society's needs. But when John B. Watson wrote his book, it changed parenting forever. It changed the way Americans parent their children, because what he proposed is that you as the parent, if you set up the environment correctly, you can shape your child's behavior into any of the appropriate behaviors you see fit for your family using the principles of conditioning. So what do we do as modern parents? We spend an enormous amount of time making sure our children have all these behavioral experiences. We've developed time out, we've developed reward systems, we've developed all of these things. These were all things presented by John B. Watson. And it wasn't until the 1930s and 40s that we see parents doing reward and punishment techniques, where we see parents becoming more of an authoritarian, shaping, do as I say type of parenting style. And part of behaviorism is that the person who is doing the shaping or the learning is kind of this objective bystander. So you see this reduction in affection towards children. So if you look at children raised between 1940 and 1970s, you find that this would be grandparents and maybe some older individuals in the classroom, those types of individuals. You will note that they didn't have a highly affectionate relationship with their parents, especially if they were raised here in the United States. That's a direct influence of Watson's book on child rearing and the influence of behaviorism on raising children, because as a parent, you don't show affection towards your child. You are there to shape them. You're not there to provide affection. Of course, within the behaviorist model, emotions, your child's feelings and your feelings don't matter anyways. So that had a direct influence on how we parented, starting from the publishing of that book and on. Another influence that it had is that is in marketing. John B. Watson changed marketing processes probably well into today. What he showed is that in order to get people to like your product more, you don't have to increase the quality of your product. You have to make the labeling, the product look more appealing. And in his classical example, he worked for a coffee company, and what he showed is just making the coffee label more fancy. They didn't change their recipe, they didn't change how they processed the coffee, but just by changing the label, people thought that the coffee tasted better than when it was just put in a plain labeled can. And we see this example today when you have macaroni and cheese is a good example. Kraft macaroni and cheese versus store macaroni and cheese, the generic brand. And people often say that Kraft macaroni and cheese is much better than the generic brand. But I would encourage you to do something. Next time you're buying or looking at those products, look at where the product is manufactured. Because you'll find that the generic and the Kraft brands were probably made in the same manufacturing plant, meaning that they're pretty much the same product, but because of the labeling, because of the reputation of Kraft has, all of those things, we will rate the product of Kraft better than the generic labeled brand. And that's just an example. Now, there are some examples of generic brands that are lower quality and whatnot, so I'm not saying this fits all, but that's a good example. The other example of how behaviorism has influenced American society is our view of criminal justice and people's behaviors in and of itself. If you look at behaviorism, as it says, it's a contingency between stimuluses and responses, meaning that the internal thoughts and processes of the individual really don't matter. So what does this mean when someone goes and does criminal activity? Well, one, it means from a behaviorist perspective that behavior should have been controllable. That it doesn't matter, for example, if a guy was stealing to get medicine for his wife or was stealing to feed his family. All that matters is that there was a stimulus, let's say $50 cash sitting on a counter, and his response, taking that $50. In that, based on behaviorism and how behaviorism has influenced the way we look at criminal behavior, is that all that matters was that stimulus and that person's response to that stimulus, which was taking it. Not considering that maybe his children haven't eaten in 3 days, or that his wife needed medicine that she's deathly ill for. We take out all of those contingencies, those mental reasons why someone does those behaviors, and we only pay attention to the actual behaviors. Hence, we have individuals who are in prison who are probably just surviving, versus individuals who probably belong there. And so it's kind of an interesting thought about how we've, in the criminal justice system, we take out the human motivation for what had been committed, and we only look at those behaviors. I think it would be a different picture if we actually looked at motivation. So that's kind of some examples of how behaviorism has specifically influenced the United States. Now, behaviorism didn't have a huge influence on Europe. They were heavily influenced by Freudian psychology and Gestalt psychology. And so, behaviorism in its heyday was really an American product and an American motivation, and hence we'll spend some time with it. There are two types of learning that we're going to look at. We're going to look at associative learning, or what we call conditioning, and we're going to look at two types: classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and we'll get to those in a minute. And then there's another type of learning that tends to be a uniquely human type of learning. Now, we do see it in other animals, but the way humans represent it is a little different, and that's observational, or what we call social learning, and we'll get to that near the end of this discussion. But for the sake of this lecture, what I want to focus on is the two types of conditioning: one, classical conditioning, and two, operant conditioning. Classical conditioning is associating stimuluses in our environment with natural responses we have to a given stimulus. So if you look in this first slide in the classical conditioning, doctors' offices are often associated with pain because that's where children get shots. So the shot elicits pain, and then the child associates everything in the doctor's office with pain. I think a better example would have been a dentist's office, right? And fear of dentists. Operant conditioning, we need to start with the word operant, which means to operate. So in classical conditioning, it does not require the response of an organism to learn something. You're simply associating something with a natural response, which we'll get into. In operant conditioning, we perform something, and then based on the consequences of that performance, we will either increase that behavior or decrease that behavior. And this is where we get into reinforcement and punishment, and how reinforcement and punishment influence behavior. But let's start with classical conditioning, which starts with a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov. Now, Ivan Pavlov was not a psychologist, and I find it ironic that he is probably most well known in psychology rather than his actual field, where he was studying the digestive systems of humans and animals. And if you really look at it, what we should be thanking Ivan Pavlov for is our understanding of things like ulcers, antacids, salivation responses, and those kinds of things. But you most often will see his name come up in psychology, talking about classical conditioning. Now, how did he come about to study classical conditioning? What he was studying is the salivation response to the presentation of different volumes and smells of food in dogs. And what he would do is he would surgically implant a tube that would capture salivation through the salivation glands of the dog, and it would fill the tube, and he would use the amount of salivation, and he would associate it and correlate it with the amount of food presented to see if how much food would produce salivation. And just as, most findings in science go, one day he was noticing that a dog started to salivate before food was presented with him. And he was curious about this, as why it was the dog would start salivating when the food wasn't right in the dog's presence. And what he observed over time is that he noticed that the dog salivated when he heard experimenters' footsteps in the room. So they would hear the clank, clank, clank of feet coming across, and that would produce salivation. And he was curious about this, so he came up with a research paradigm in order to research this response. And this is kind of what it looks like. So this is kind of how he kind of set up his experiment and how it went. So before conditioning, the UCS on the left-hand side stands for an unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus produces what's called a UCR, which is an unconditioned response. What this is when a stimulus elicits a response that requires no experience or learning. So in pretty much any animal that feeds, food produces salivation. It doesn't require any type of learning for this event to occur. Now we know that there are things that shouldn't produce salivation, such as a bell. So a neutral stimulus like a bell equals no response of salivation. What Pavlov did during the conditioning phase is he would pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, which would produce salivation. So he would pair those two over and over. And then what he would do is just present the neutral stimulus without the food. And if the neutral stimulus produced salivation, he then called that a CS, or a conditioned stimulus, which produces a conditioned response. So this is kind of what classical conditioning is I want you to think about this, about when you walk into a kitchen and no food is actually displayed, you start feeling hunger pains. And we could probably go on and on and on about how the different types of stimuluses in your environment that should not produce hunger, but they do. Some other good examples, with study habits, for example. If early on when you were studying, you ate food, probably when you go to study, you feel like you need to have a drink there with you, or some type of eating device while you study. That would be an example of classical conditioning. There's some general rules that go along with classical conditioning. The first one is generalization. This is where a conditioned response may appear after various neutral stimuluses that are similar to the conditioned stimulus. So an example of this is in the little Albert experiments. An example of generalization is, so they made the fear response of the little white rat paired with the bell, and that conditioned response, so little Albert would have a fear response to the little white mouse. Well, what happened with little Albert, and how this fits with generalization, is that they then started presenting little Albert with other small white objects, like a white pillow, a white blanket, and he generalized that fear response to anything small, white, and furry. That would be an example of generalization. Discrimination is when, for some reason, we don't have a response to a similar stimulus, meaning that, for example, some of us can be fearful of a small white rat, but really enjoy a small white bunny rabbit. These are two very similar stimuluses, but because we were conditioned that the little white bunny rabbits are soft and furry and kind, and little white rats were paired, let's say, with a loud noise or mom screaming as it went across the floor, we discriminate that stimulus. So that's an example of discrimination. In classical conditioning, we can look at 4 basic phases that are kind of interesting. One, in the acquisition phase, is when we're pairing the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. And near the end, what we should have is when we just present the conditioned stimulus, it should have a high response rate to a conditioned response. Now, if we continue to just present the conditioned stimulus without the presentation of an unconditioned stimulus every once in a while, that behavior will extinguish, meaning it will go away. Now, this is very helpful information when we're trying to extinguish fear. So one way to extinguish fear is through what we call exposure therapy. So let's say you have a fear of snakes and you want to get over it. The best way to get over it would then be to expose yourself to snakes without any harm coming to you. If you pair yourself with that snake over and over and over, that fear response will eventually go away. Now, there's kind of an interesting thing that happens. So let's say we extinguish this response with this conditioned stimulus, and then we have a rest period where the conditioned stimulus isn't presented or anything like that. And then one day we run into that conditioned stimulus. We have what's called a spontaneous recovery, which is a response to that stimulus, even though it hasn't been paired or you haven't experienced it for a while. Okay. So let me give you kind of a real life example that you can apply to this. And we can look at relationships. And we can look at relationship phases. So we meet someone new, and we pair them with all kinds of fabulous things. We go on exciting dates. We go on all of these wonderful things, and we meet in exciting places, and of course we're presenting our best selves. So we pair all of this fun with this novel stimulus. And over time we go to associate that, let's go girl to guy, that he's Mr. Wonderful, because we've associated all of these great dates and all this excitement with this individual. Well, as relationship goes on, we get into the regular everydays of life. And we stop going on the exciting dates, and we stop doing all those things, and we start revealing all of our, even our bad habits. And what happens is because we didn't keep that excitement up, that pairing up, we're just presented with that individual. And our feelings for that individual then can wane or be extinguished. Okay, and so we find that the person isn't these things that we thought they were, so we break up with them. Okay, now this is kind of something that kind of often happens, and why a lot of literature talks about be careful of the rebound effect, because it's usually the person, not the person doing the rebounding in dating, but it's the person who's receiving the rebound dater. Because what happens is when we get to this extinguishing phase, we break up with the individual, and then we start dating someone else, trying to find that exciting person again. Well, what happens is that we'll start dating somebody, and then let's say a month later, we're at the grocery store and we run into that ex. Well, what happens is we have this spontaneous recovery, where most or some of all those exciting feelings that we originally paired with that individual when we first started dating them come back. And then we go back to that rebound person we're dating, and we go, you know what? I ran into my ex the other day, and I'm having those feelings for them again, and maybe this isn't a good idea. And then of course, in the example, you go back to the ex, you go through that excitement phase again, and then you go, oh, they're not, and then we go through extinction again. So there's that process, right? Another good example is in relationships, and we want to keep and maintain relationships. And we'll talk about this later in the course, about how to maintain a long-term relationship. One of the ways to think about it is using this classical conditioning paradigm. People who are in long-term successful relationships tend to change, and they change together. And they recognize that not only do individuals change over time, but so do relationships. And so they constantly are redefining what their relationship is in the context of a world where we're constantly changing. That keeps all of these things exciting and thrilling, and we never end up getting bored with each other. Now, I want you to think about kind of what happens in relationships. We go through a period where we're changing and we're learning about each other, and then we go, you know what? Our relationship is strong enough. We don't need to work on it anymore. And so we pay little attention to our relationship, and what happens is the feelings we have based on classical conditioning start to extinguish. And one day you wake up with each other and you kind of go, you know, I don't know who you are anymore. And we go through this phase of splitting up or breaking up. But then we have periods where we come back together, where we experience that excitement again. And so a recommendation, to help relationships is when you are going through this phase of extinction, it's really important to do something different, to do something exciting. Now, this is also good relationship advice. So what can you do during, for example, Valentine's Day to make your partner want you more? Here's what I would do. So let's say Valentine's Day is on a Saturday. What you'd want to do is take a business trip from Monday to Friday, and just tell your partner, hey, I'm going to be out of town. I won't be around a cell phone or anything, and I'll be back on Saturday, and we'll meet for dinner, and we'll celebrate dinner together. Well, what that rest period is going to create is, upon your return, it's going to create what's called the spontaneous recovery, where she or he will be so excited to see you. All of those previous feelings in that beginning phase of the relationship will return, and you'll make your Valentine's Day a lot more exciting, because your partner will be that much more excited to see you. All right, so now let's talk about, we talked just a minute about some applications of classical conditioning, and we'll go over a few here. So we talked about phobias. I encourage you to look at the little Albert experiment video. And an important thing is one of the best treatments right now for phobias is this thing we call extinction, where we expose the individual to their fear response. Another good way is counter conditioning. This is where we associate a conditioned stimulus with a new incompatible conditioned response. So for example, this is an example of aversion conditioning. So this is where you take something incompatible and compare it with something that will not want you to do that behavior in the future. Some other examples of classical conditioning are things like placebo effect, where we associate the effect of a novel stimulus with getting better. Your immune system and your endocrine system are classically conditioned. So, for example, when you take an antibiotic or something like that, or like the flu vaccine or whatever, those are actual dead or sometimes alive flu viruses. And what you're doing when you take a flu shot is you're injecting the flu virus into your system, and that allows your immune system to remember how to attack that virus. And so when it enters the body in the future, it has that refresher course, is kind of way to think of a flu shot. It has that refresher course of how to attack that virus. Taste aversion, probably best example of taste aversion is about, gosh, it's been 11 years now. I was starting a new medication, and that medication made me horribly sick. But at the time that the sickness started, I went to dinner that night and I had fettuccine Alfredo. Now, I associated the taste and texture of fettuccine Alfredo with how sick the medication made me. Now, even though logically I know it was the medication and not the fettuccine Alfredo, just the smell or the look of fettuccine Alfredo 11 years later gives me nauseous feelings. In fact, I was at a Olive Garden a couple weeks ago, and the person I was with ordered fettuccine Alfredo, and I actually had to excuse myself to the restroom because it made me sick. We talked about advertising with Watson a little bit, and how labeling and making things associated with quality can increase our perception that that product is actually better when not necessarily. Drug habituation, if you remember the extinguishing phase of classical conditioning, if we just keep presenting the drug when it's not needed, we will habituate to the response to that drug. So those are some applications of classical conditioning. There's a lot more. There's a lot of things we could talk about, such as addiction and other mental issues. But I think we'll stop there with classical conditioning and go on to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning better explains how we develop voluntary behavior. And what we're looking for with operant conditioning is the consequences of a behavior that change. The consequences of behavior change the probability of the behavior occurrences. So this is where we basically commit a behavior and then we look at the consequences of it to see if we will do that behavior in the future. And just some basic principles of this starts with Thorndike's law of effect, which you probably read in the textbook, where the consequences strengthen or weaken the connection between a stimulus and response connection. So remember, behaviorism, we're only looking at stimuluses in the environment and responses of the individual. And according to the law of effect, the consequences, whether it's punished or rewarded, either increase or decrease the connection between those stimuluses and responses. B.F. Skinner is going to expand on Thorndike's work by talking about different types of consequences that either increase or decrease the response of an organism. So when we're talking about consequences that increase a response, we're usually talking about reinforcement. In lay terms, this is called reward, but in psychology, we refer to reinforcement. There's two types of reinforcement. There's positive and negative reinforcement. Now, both of these increase behavior. And probably the mistake that most people make is the word positive and negative. When you look at these words, I don't want you to think of it as an emotional term. Positive and negative are not emotional terms. In positive reinforcement, we're going to add something. In negative reinforcement, we're going to take something away. So when we talk about reinforcement, positive means adding, negative means taking away. When we talk about positive reinforcement, we're talking about our behavior is followed by a reward that is added, a positive consequence that is added. When we're talking about negative reinforcement, we're talking about when an aversive stimulus is taken away, which is rewarding to the individual. So we can actually talk about these two types of reinforcement in one single example, and that is a child throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. So I want you to imagine child goes, "Mommy, I want a candy bar." And mommy says no. And so the child starts throwing a tantrum, yelling, screaming, ending up on the floor in this catatonic flaying motion and causing a rustle. And so mom finally does what? She finally gives a child a candy bar. Okay. Now we have two types of reinforcement and two individuals that are being reinforced. The child is being positively reinforced because he's receiving the candy bar for his behavior, which is a positive stimulus. So that's positive reinforcement. The mom is being negatively reinforced for giving the child the candy bar, because when the child gives the candy bar, he stops his tantrum behavior, removal of the unpleasant stimuli, which is reinforcing to the mother. Hence, when we look at tantrum behaviors in a grocery store, we need to realize that there's two people being reinforced for that behavior dynamic. Now, most people will look at this behavior and we will go and we'll assign a value to that system. So what we'll say is that child is a horrible child and that mother is a horrible mother. We assign value to those individuals. What I would encourage you to do after this lecture is to look at it differently, because operant and classical conditioning do not occur in the rational frontal lobe area of the brain. They occur in the limbic system. The limbic system is only concerned with the reward and the avoidance of punishment. It is emotionally focused. It is not a rationally based system. And so when we assign a value system that mother should know better and that child should be disciplined more, we're thinking of it in an erroneous way. Hence, because we think of that behavior that way, that behavior is very, very hard to get rid of, because just calling a mom horrible and a child rotten isn't going to extinguish this reinforcement process that is going on in the lower limbic area of the brain. And so that's something to think about if you have a child who is throwing tantrums and things. Don't think of yourself as a horrible parent or your child as a horrible child. Or when you view it next time, look at it from more of a basis of a behavioral process and lower the judgment level a little bit. Here's some examples of reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, you turn your homework in on time, teacher praises your performance, you increase turning your homework in time. Conversely, if you look at negative reinforcement, you turn your homework in on time, teacher stops criticizing you for turning your homework late in time, therefore you increase turning your homework in on time. And that's kind of how those two work together. For the sake of time, I know your book talks about principles of reinforcement, avoidance things, and also the book, and we just talked about generalization, discrimination, and extinction, and spontaneous recovery as related to operant classical conditioning. They are the same as with operant conditioning as well. Those principles transfer. I also want to encourage you to look at the schedules of reinforcement in your book and understand those. I want to look at this table, and I'd encourage you to follow along with it. is when we look at different types of schedules of reinforcement, we have a fixed ratio or a variable interval. When we look at intervals, we're looking at rewards or reinforcements are given based on time. So in a fixed interval, let's say we reinforce every 10 minutes. On a variable interval, it may be 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 15 minutes, 10 minutes. You're not sure when based on time, when you're going to be reinforced. Okay, when we're talking about ratio, we're either talking about you're reinforced every time you commit that behavior, which is a fixed ratio schedule, or a variable ratio schedule is when you are reinforced only for a certain number of times that you commit that behavior. You're not sure when you're going to be reinforced. It just occurs. Okay. Now, if we look at which of these schedules are best, the number one reinforcement schedule that works the best is actually the variable ratio, meaning that you don't reward the person every single time, but you put them on a schedule where they're not sure when they're going to be reinforced. It could be every 2 times, every 3 times, every once or twice, those types of things. And that one actually is more resistant to extinction and those types of things because we're always looking for that reinforcement. Now, if we're a supervisor, let's look at this from a business perspective. How often should we go and check our workers' work? Okay. Well, if we look at this is the fixed interval versus a variable interval. So let's say you're a general manager and you visit a place every 3 months. What you will find is this kind of scalloped look performance for your individuals. So if they know that you're going to be there every 3 months, their performance will increase 15 or so days before you get there, and then their performance will decrease for the next couple months, meaning that you'll only get performance increases right when they know that the boss is going to be in the room. However, if you tell your employees that you are just going to randomly show up and check on their work, you will get a steady performance throughout. You will not get a deficit in performance, especially when the employee does not know when you're going to check on their work. So those are good ways to use schedules of reinforcement. Please read these a little bit more in depth in the text. Now, what about decreasing behavior? This one we call punishment. And we have, again, 2 types of punishment. We have positive punishment where we're going to add an unpleasant stimulus, which is going to decrease behavior. And we have negative punishment. Now, negative punishment, we're going to take away a rewarding stimulus, which should decrease behavior. So, when we talk about positive punishment, probably the best example is when a person gets spanked or something like that, or criticized, yelled at, those types of things. That's a form of positive punishment. You commit the behavior, and then that behavior results in a negative aversion. Okay. Negative punishment would be kind of an example of taking your teen's Nintendo away or taking their cell phone away. You're removing a positive, which puts the person in an aversive consequence and then creates the chance of that behavior not being committed again. Now, some examples of positive and negative punishment: you take a medication to cure a headache. you have a bad allergic reaction, so you avoid that medication in the future. You take a medication to cure a headache, the headache goes away, you take more of that medication in the future. Okay, that's negative reinforcement. Negative punishment would be, I want to go back for just a second and talk about these just a little bit more. So a lot of times parents will ask, I've taken away the Nintendo, I've taken away the car keys, I've taken away the computer, and they still are committing that behavior. And one of the things that I want to say about reinforcement and punishment from a parenting perspective is really when we do punishment and reinforcement with children, we're actually violating the rules of reinforcement and punishment, usually by giving the element of choice. Okay, so let me give this an example. Usually we set up rules with children where we say, all right, if you do your homework, you get a cookie. If you go past your curfew, you get your cell phone taken away. All of those violate the rules of operant and classical conditioning because you've cognized the event. Okay, so let's take the example of a child breaking curfew. So their curfew is, let's say, 11 p.m. Now I want to put you in the mind of the individual. So let's say they go to a friend's party and it's 10:50 p.m., the time they should be leaving the party. Now in their mind they're going, okay, a future consequence is that I'm going to have my cell phone taken away. But in the present context, they're being reinforced for staying at the party. So let's say it's a guy, so there's cute girls around, which are positive stimuluses. At some teen parties, there's different types of things the teen can take that are in the moment reinforcing, such as alcohol or other types of medications. Maybe they're playing video games with their friends, which is heavily reinforcing. So what does the teen go? Because they're being reinforced for what they're doing in that moment, they're going to choose to stay in that reinforcing condition because that consequence does not outweigh the reinforcement they're receiving right here in the moment. Okay? And so when you give choice, you have to understand that what the person is going to do is they're going to weigh that consequence based on the reinforcement that they're receiving in that moment. And a lot of times when a teen is around his or her peers, is having fun, that momentary reinforcement they receive right then is going to outweigh any punishment the parent is going to give for violating their curfew. So, how do you break a child's staying out late issue? Using the rules of operant and classical conditioning. Well, here's what you do. You tell your child that their curfew is 11 p.m. Knowing that in order to get home at time at 11 p.m., they need to leave this given friend's home at 10:50 p.m. What should you do as a parent? Well, at 10:51 p.m., you should show up to the friend's door in your, your night gear and full parent outfit, and you should knock on the door and say, "Hi, sweetie. I just want to make sure you're going to be home for your curfew tonight at 11 p.m., you know you should have left a minute ago. All right, you do that once or twice, and you introduce that punishment in that rewarding condition that the child is in, I can almost guarantee that you will break your child's curfew breaking behaviors. And that's how you would use that. And again, with children, you got to remember, anytime you implement choice, you're implementing the ability for that child to break that rule. And if breaking that rule in that momentary situation is more reinforcing than the future reward or punishment, the child will engage in that rule-breaking behavior. That's why it's a good idea as a parent to have rules, but don't tell your child the consequence. You choose the consequence. The child shouldn't. And so when the child breaks the rules, you and your partner have agreed that this is what happens. The child is not aware of that consequence. That will more likely break that behavior in the future. So here are just some examples of comparing operant procedures: positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. I want to spend just a couple minutes on observational, or what we call social learning. And this comes from Albert Bandura, and I'm going to post a video of his famous Bobo doll experiments. What social learning is it's a lot different from operant and classical conditioning, because it does two things. One, there is no immediate reward or punishment for this procedure. Two, we're bringing back the idea of mental representation. And so social learning was introduced when behaviorism was starting to fall, because everything in human nature is too invariable just to explain behavior by stimulus-response associations. In order to understand human behavior, we need to take in cognitive and emotional states. And we started to recognize that in the late 50s, 60s, and into what we call the cognitive revolution and the humanistic movement, which we'll get to in week 5 when we talk about personality. But for now, let's talk about observational learning. Observational learning really developed out of classical Bobo studies. In the Bobo doll studies, what Bandura did is he had an adult set up those Bobo dolls where you punch the doll and the doll comes back up. You'll see in the video kind of what it is. And the adult was either very good with the doll, they just fixed the doll up and blew it up with no aggression. In the second condition, the adult was very aggressive. He hit it with hammers and hit it and was really aggressive with the doll. And then a day later or so, the child was presented with the Bobo dolls. Now, this is a very, very basic understanding of the Bobo dolls experiments. It goes very much beyond this, and there's a lot of nuances that we won't get into this. But the basic findings is that the child who observed the aggression was much more aggressive with the doll, where the child who did not observe the aggression was less aggressive. Now that's a very basic understanding of that, but for our sake, that's kind of what it is. Now, what Bandura argued is that when we learn through observing, you have to take in 4 basic processes. One, you have to attend to it. So you have to observe a behavior being committed, and then we have to retain that. And usually we do that through mental representation. We play it over in our head, and then we motor produce it, and then we see if we can, whether we're reinforced for committing that same behavior. So let me give you an example. Next week, when we talk about developmental psychology, we'll talk about the age between 3 and 6. This is where role playing is really an important aspect of child development and play. Because what is a child doing when they're playing between the age of 3 and 6? Usually what they're doing is they're looking at mom and dad, seeing how mom and dad are behaving, or they're looking at the TV and they're looking at action figures and stuff like that, doing stuff. They're then mentally representing that in their mind, and then they're going and trying those behaviors with other children through play. So you watch mom and dad interact with each other, and then you go play house with your friends. You watch Superman on TV, you mentally represent yourself as Superman, and then you and your buddies go play Superman. This type of observation and then reproduction is what we call observational learning or social learning. Now, this is an important part of human condition. Now, we know that lots of primates, monkeys and those kinds of things, and a lot of different mammals do observational learning. So, for example, in a wolf pack, the baby wolves will observe mom, and then they'll interact in aggressive play, all of those types of things. But observational learning is kind of a unique thing for humans in that a lot of our complex behaviors occur through this social connective learning thing. So, for example, we know that we'll talk about next week how children who lack the role-playing ability of one of the different sexes in a parent relationship influences their ability to interact with that sex when they're an adult. And we'll talk about that next week. So observational learning, you'll find that is an important aspect of human behavior. And it's so important that we do it without even recognizing it. So when we're interacting with someone new, if we record a person's behavior, they actually start taking on the mannerisms of that individual that they just met. So they'll start mimicking them. Now, a lot of people go, nah, I don't do that. What I would encourage you to do, with permission, of course, is when you meet someone new, if you're going to have like a 45-minute conversation with them, record them. And what you'll notice is come about 30 minutes into meeting this person, you'll do what's called behavior matching, meaning that you'll start having the same facial features, the same sitting postures. You'll start matching their voice and their language. It's something that us as humans kind of do, and it allows us to increase empathy and understanding of that individual. So we'll end with this slide, and the importance of observational learning in the human condition is that it's a process of attention, retaining it, motor producing it, and then seeing if our reproduction of that behavior is reinforced. This ends our kind of discussion on learning theory. Make sure you look at the details within your book. And next we will be talking about memory and memory processes to move on with our understanding of the way we change and learn throughout our experiences.